our fellow legal hackers, even if his group is not legal hackers.
It is legal hackers. I was at the original annual meeting in Chicago.
Legal hackers' grandfather here. He's young, but so he just said he was coming over to Madrid, so we just thought, okay, Dan has plenty of awesome to tell us. And
our coordinator from Legal Hackers Panama is also here with us. Not she's in the other room having a conference call, but she will come later to attend the meetup as well. So tomorrow we have 3 legal hackers representatives: Madrid, Detroit, Panama, which is
Chicago.
Detroit and Chicago. Yes. Right. So 4. Panama, Chicago, Detroit, and Madrid, which is a special event. Thank you very much for coming. We hope you enjoy. So,
thank you, sir. Thank you. So hi, I'm Dan Linna, and just to get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I started the Legal Hackers Detroit group about 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago actually now. And then Dan Katz and I co-founded the Legal Hackers group in Chicago, and we've got over 1,000 people in the group in Chicago, so it's been very, very successful there. And so very nice to see that there's a robust group here in Madrid. And so I first met Laura at the Legal Hackers meetup in Brooklyn, in New York, a couple of years ago. Are you coming to the event, to this?
I wish I was.
Okay. So this is a project that I undertook last summer, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I'm a law professor at Michigan State University College of Law, where I'm the director of Legal R&D, the Center for Legal Services Innovation. I'm also an adjunct law professor at the University of Michigan, an affiliated faculty member at Stanford Codex, the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, and next year I will be a visiting professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law in Chicago. Before I went to law school, I worked in information technology. I worked for a group of companies and designed enterprise information systems. I also designed data-driven websites. I, at the same time, got a master's degree in public policy, where I did some training in econometrics and very much data-driven policy analysis, things like that. I always knew I wanted to go to law school, so at some point I decided to leave technology and go to law school. I kind of at the time that none of this was going to be relevant for me, because in the practice of law, technology is not something that we make great use of, data is not something we make great use of, but now it's turned out that years later, these skills, this has come in handy. I went to law school at the University of Michigan. I worked for a federal court judge for a year. I was a clerk for 1 year. And then I practiced law at Honigman, an AmLaw 200 law firm in Detroit, Michigan. Did a lot of work for General Motors there in the automotive industry when they went through their bankruptcy. And I was at Honigman at Michigan State as an adjunct faculty member, and at the University of Michigan as a faculty member, and then I joined Michigan State full time. And so the innovation index, where it stems from, is every year at Stanford there is an annual meeting at Codex, a future law conference. And this is Jim Sandman. He did the opening keynote there. This was 2 years ago. He's the president of the Legal Services Corporation in the United States, so the leading body that provides a lot of funding to legal aid organizations. And he gave a talk talking about how, these rankings on law firms, like the Global 100, the AmLaw 200, it's all about revenue and profit. And what Jim was talking about is, well, to improve legal service delivery and to improve legal services so we can improve access for people, we should start ranking law firms by technology. And so at the time I thought it was a really good idea, and I thought someone would do that. But just last year, Jim was back at Stanford Codex Future Law, and here he is looking quite distressed because no one had done anything with his suggestion that someone create this innovation index. And so sitting in the audience that day, I thought, especially kind of this ethos of legal hackers idea, right? It's like, well, this is a space where there is nothing. How could I create something here in this space? How could I create some sort of a measure of innovation across the industry? And so why does it matter to measure innovation? And if you've been in this legal hackers group, you've probably encountered attorneys or others who say, oh, we don't need technology. Technology is not for lawyers. Things aren't changing in the industry. right? Lots of anecdotes, lots of opinions and anecdotes, and I wanted to move from that to, well, let's gather data. Let's try to actually measure what is going on in the legal industry. Want to create transparency so we can actually see what's going on inside of law firms. How are they using technology? Raise awareness, kind of demonstrate to law students, people inside of law schools, lawyers generally, what's happening, how technology data is being used. Foster accountability. Right? As a lawyer, particularly in the United States, where we have a monopoly on practice as a lawyer, and it's pretty much the same place around the world, right? You can keep other people from delivering legal services. Well, we as lawyers should be accountable. We should be improving the legal services. We should be improving the justice system. We should be improving access to legal services. So we want to foster accountability and then empower consumers. So if it's corporate legal departments, our individuals, help them understand what are lawyers doing to deliver legal services. And so what better way to take on an innovation project than to kind of follow an innovative process, right? Thinking about lean startup, all these different principles, right, that, as far as how to tackle innovation. And so that was kind of what I had in mind. Instead of the kind of the typical lawyer mindset where usually perfect is the enemy of the good, kind of, the idea that, well, how do I do the 20% of the work that produces 80% of the value? How do I create a minimum viable product around this? So I went back to Michigan State, put together a research team of students, and then started trying to figure out how we're going to tackle this, how we're going to create a measure of legal services innovation. And so the Innovation Index, and this is all available online, it's wide open, legaltechinnovation.com. It's hosted on LexBlog. I built it in Tableau to capture the information, but it consists of a catalog, which is basically innovations that are being discussed like in books and magazine articles, in popular press, and then an index where I went across 260 law firm websites and measured the extent to which they're talking about innovation, and then a prototype of law school innovation index. Okay, so first of all, let me just talk here briefly about the catalog of law firm legal service delivery innovation. Right? So we've all seen these articles where people will talk about different innovative firms and what they might be doing, but no one had really undertaken to curate all that information, categorize it, and try to make sense of it, so pull it together. So here are quite a few sources from which I pulled information to create this catalog of legal services innovation. Carla Swansburg in Toronto at Blake, Castles and Graydon contributed a bunch of research. So a lot of law firms are kind of gathering this information themselves, but keeping it internally. So how do they get this information and then make it publicly available on the website is what I did. Now, this information is interesting for a lot of different reasons. So first of all, so like I said, we're categorizing it, breaking it down. Some of this is an innovative way to deliver a current legal service, so some new way to provide services. Some of it is the productization of different services. So how do you take advice and turn it into a product? And then some of it is consulting, like different consulting arrangements that a law firm might offer. One of the interesting things is there are a lot of, you can't see this real well, but there are a lot of anecdotes about how in the United States, people talk about the United Kingdom is ahead of the United States in innovation. And the data that came out of this study would seem to lend some support for that, because there were more entries in the catalog from the United Kingdom than there were from the US. But so this is one way to break it down into these groups and by jurisdiction. Then another useful thing to do is to break it down as far as the area of law. And so not surprisingly, there's been a lot happening around technology-assisted review, electronic discovery, things like that. So we see those sorts of categories. But we're also starting to see privacy and data security, employment law, intellectual property, real estate, bankruptcy, right? So we're seeing innovation efforts from different law firms now come into different practice areas. And again, the idea here was like to empower students in law schools, but also lawyers and law firms to be able to see it, and also their customers. And quite a few corporate legal department lawyers have said that they're looking at this when they're trying to choose their law firms out. They're looking at this to see kind of who's trying to innovate in these different spaces. And then the tool or discipline, right? Now, some of these are just, again, new ways to deliver services, and that was the majority of the items on the list. Some of these are innovation entities, so some of the law firms like Denton's has Next Law Labs, Allen & Overy has Fuse, like they have these different law firms now that have, have innovation entities. Some of them are external. They may be a subsidiary or an affiliate of some kind. Some of them are an internally branded sort of unit focused just on delivering innovation. But then we see other intelligence, expert systems, knowledge management, project management. So you can read all this on the website. I won't read all of them to you, but the idea of just trying to get a sense for what are the disciplines that are driving these different innovations. And then on the website, everyone is listed by law firm, and it identifies the different partners, who they're working with, what the area of law is, the tool or discipline that's driving it, and then you can drill down. There's additional information. Like this is about the Ackerman Data Law Center. It's Ackerman Law Firm working with Thomson Reuters and the Logic. It breaks it all down, and then there's a link to where it exists on the law firm website. So the idea is to be a nice resource to be able to, if you're interested in a particular practice area or change or what's happening with artificial intelligence, expert systems, and so on, you can go here and you can see what's happening in these different categories. All right, so that tells us a bit about what we know about it. It's just kind of like pulling together information that's in news articles, books, and so on. But what about the rest of the landscape that we don't know anything about? How are we going to measure innovation for the rest of the law firms out there? Well, what I decided to do is to look at some of the top law firms in the world. So the Global 100, the AmLaw 200, and the Canadian Top 30. And so when you break it down, it ends up being 260 law firms. And so how might we measure innovation across those law firms? Well, what I thought is like every one of these law firms has a website, right? And they're saying on their website what they're doing to serve their clients. They want their clients to read their website and learn about the innovative efforts that they're undertaking. So how could I figure out a way to use searches to look at all of their websites? Now I thought at first like, well, maybe I'll scrape their websites, I'll download everything, but then eventually I just decided, well, why don't I just use Google Advanced Search? I'll create categories of innovation and search terms and then see how many search hits we have. Okay? And so that's exactly what I did. 10 categories that I thought would, based on the work for the catalog and then other research, would kind of correlate, would be a proxy for measuring whether a law firm is innovative when it's talking about these things on its website. So alternative fees, right? This movement from the billable hour to fixed fees or different ways of billing clients. Project management, this has been something that's been spoken about for a long time, where clients have been telling their law firms that they should be using project management. Process improvement or innovation framework, right? Design thinking, everyone's heard of design thinking, that's all the rage these days. Lean thinking, Six Sigma, I did a workshop this morning on the improvement kata, right? All these different ways to be client-centric and improve, to improve the delivery services. Knowledge management, and then automation basics, so if you're creating expert systems, document automation tools, document assembly tools, things like that. Data analytics, so using data to get better outcomes, to predict fees, all the different ways in which data can be used. Artificial intelligence, legal operations. So how many people have heard of Corporate Legal Operations Consortium? Has anyone heard of that by any chance? So that's growing very rapidly. It's in-house legal departments that are hiring people now to think not just about the law, but the delivery of legal services. And so corporate legal departments are hiring, doing more and more of their work internally rather than hiring outside law firms. And wildly in the United States, and CLOC, Corporate Legal Operations Consortium, has expanded to Europe, to Asia. It's really a movement that is pushing a lot of the change. But so legal operations, and we're seeing kind of those roles evolve and develop in the law firms as well, and in legal aid and in corporate legal departments, right? This idea, how do you manage your resources to produce the outcomes you want to have? Proactive law, this idea of you can prevent problems, prevent disputes, or how do you know the business and generate value by being proactive rather than one of my friends who's a general counsel back in the United States talks all the time that lawyers, it's like, you know, we follow around the elephant, waiting for the elephant to drop, you know, and we just clean up the mess, right? And it's like, well, wait, why don't we try to prevent the mess before it happens instead of just always cleaning up the mess? Like, why don't we be more proactive and try to prevent problems? And then blockchain. And blockchain is a little bit of a hybrid because it's really more of a substantive area. However, law firms are seeing that there's opportunities to think about how to use blockchain to improve legal service delivery as well, like writing contracts on blockchain, smart contracts, and so on. Okay, so what do we see? Well, first, a couple of caveats, and I just put a lot of caveats on the website, especially because I knew law firms would look at this and question it. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna admit that of course there's there's some weaknesses. I mean, this is just a proxy, right? I'm trying to measure something, just like a lot of research, a lot of studies. It's not a perfect measure, but we think it gives us some insight. So looking at the terms on the website. But there might be gaps between what the law firm is actually doing and what they say on their website. Now, if they're doing more than they say on their website, well, that would seem to be a problem. Why aren't they talking about the things that they're actually doing on their website? But it could cut the other way, that maybe they're not doing as much as what they say on their website. Language translation issues, because the search terms are in English, and so if for different law firms that English is not their first language, all of the law firms have an English page or pages, but then there's going to be underrepresentation usually for those sites. So that's a little bit of an issue. And then finally, the last thing is just this idea that what I really want to see, and I think most people want to see in this area, is like this idea of creating a learning organization, right? The innovation isn't really a top-down thing. You want to create an organization where everyone is empowered in the organization. The people who are closest to the customers, who are really doing the work, are empowered to innovate and constantly be thinking about improving what they're doing, adding value for the customer. And so to some extent, again, this may be a proxy for some of those things, but it's possible that there could be a disconnect for some firms like this. So the organizations where it's really going to be sustainable, you'd want to see that they're building really an organization where they're committed to continuous improvement and innovation. Okay, so what do we see then when we look at the different websites? Well, the longest bar here is for blockchain, and that's a little bit of an outlier because there's some false positives around law firms that have practice groups around blockchain. So you're going to see some hits, too many hits on blockchain because of that. But as you might expect, project management, which has been discussed a lot for a long time now, there are lots of hits on project management. Artificial intelligence, we see a lot of activity around artificial intelligence. Alternative fees, analytics, knowledge management, a lot of activity there. A growing number around process improvement and design frameworks, design thinking, a little bit around automation, less around legal operations and proactive law. Now again, one of the things that was interesting is this idea of looking at jurisdictions, because as I mentioned before, there's this idea that the UK is a little bit ahead of the United States, and here's some data suggesting that. I mean, you look at the Global 100. In the US, the law firms that were in the AmLaw 1 through 50, that are part of the Global 100, I just kept them in this category. So here, if you compare the United Kingdom to the US, you see many more hits on pink as project management, right? So the Global 100 UK firms are talking a lot more about project management than their counterparts in the US. You see a lot more discussion, orange is artificial intelligence, a lot more discussion of artificial intelligence in the UK firms. And then the other thing I would point out is process, right? You see just a little sliver here where in the US firms are talking about process improvement, but a much larger number that are talking about process improvement in the UK, which is also kind of an interesting takeaway from this. Now, if you go to the website, you'll see all 260 of those law firms have an entry here, and I've kind of cut off their names to protect the innocent, and that's why you can look it up on the website. And what I did then too is because some of these have outliers, I created an index of this. So within each category, I ordered them so that if you have the most hits, you get a 1 for the category, the least hits is 0, in the middle you get a 0.50, and then we have a 10-point scale. And then so you can look at the list too, these percentile rank orders, and you can look into the different categories and sort however you want. And so this has generated a lot of interest in the US and really around the world. I've gotten a lot of interest from doing this. And I think I was a little bit sheepish, frankly, about when I first did it, because I was like, oh, this is nothing, just like this small little hacker project, and then like a lot of people, it's had about coming close to, it's over 25,000 views. So, it got a lot of articles written about it in the United States, which was interesting, was good. And I got a lot of good feedback for some of the leading innovators in the United States, which was nice. And then, so that kind of gave me the, right away I thought, okay, well I should do this for law schools because this has gotten some good traction doing it for law firms. So now I should do it for law schools. And so the law school innovation one, what I decided to do is come with a prototype. And you know, in my opinion, there's not nearly enough innovation in law schools in the United States. I mean, there are a handful of programs. I lead one of them at Michigan State. Dan Katz, who runs the Legal Hackers Group Chicago, I think runs one at Chicago campus. There's just a handful of them. So I decided I'm going to start trying to look at the law schools that have been recognized in articles and books as innovative. And it turned out there are about 40 of them that have been recognized for one reason or another. And when I was looking at them, what I'm looking for is not just, law schools have a little bit of a history of teaching law and technology classes, right? But what they're really doing is just teaching the lawyers the law of something, right? The law of the internet. Not getting lawyers to be entrepreneurs and business people and getting them to think about how do we improve our products? How do we build better business models, right? All these things that I think a lot of us think that lawyers ought to be doing. So the focus is really on looking at legal service delivery, innovation, and technology disciplines. And those disciplines are looking at the business of law, really kind of legal operations again. And so even if it's in a nonprofit or something, like thinking about how do you run the organization, process improvement, leadership, project management, innovative or entrepreneurial lawyering, computational law, so like thinking writing law as code, blockchain, smart contracts, things like that, empirical methods, so basic research methods, data analytics, technology basics, which is really just thinking about using Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, just basic things, and then applied technology. So teaching students about how to build expert systems, chatbots, things like that. The law and tech classes, artificial intelligence in law, blockchain in law, cybersecurity in law, e-discovery, and entrepreneurship and law. Right? So now, this was not the focus, but the idea was that if they're teaching these other legal service delivery disciplines, then these classes supplement the teaching of those. So there's value in having both of them. So when we went through and looked, these 40 schools are considered innovative. 30 of them were teaching the business of law. Not quite a third, about a third were teaching process improvement, a little more than half teaching leadership, a small amount, not even a quarter, teaching project management. And so that's an underrepresented area. Even though business schools tend to teach project management, for some reason lawyers and law schools particularly don't want to teach project management, it seems. Innovative and entrepreneurial lawyering, computational law is fairly low, but that's something that's relatively new, thinking about law as code and getting people to think about blockchain, things like that. Empirical methods has been around for a while, so it wasn't surprising that more than half of these 40 schools are teaching that. Data analytics relatively low, applied technology and technology basics at about the same level. So these numbers seem okay, but if you think about it, well, these are like 40 of the most innovative schools, and still not very many of these subjects are being taught in those schools, right? So you could argue that there's a long way to go. A little bit more light on a couple of these topics here, like cybersecurity now is being taught widely in a lot of schools. E-discovery is taught in quite a few schools, but it's not even close to, it's just barely getting up to like the 70% mark with the teaching of e-discovery. Blockchain is relatively new. There's a handful of schools teaching that, and a number of schools that are teaching artificial intelligence. So there's so we see that these schools, these innovative schools, right? This is just a look at kind of like on those 10 legal service delivery, innovation, and technology disciplines taught. When you look at this, it gives you a sense like that so many of those 40 are just teaching like 2 or 3 of those classes, right? So not very many really have a whole curriculum around thinking about innovative lawyering and improving legal service delivery. And then on the website, if you go to the website, there's a space and to be able to drill down on this. And one of the things that I want to do now in the next version of this, and I gave a talk about this at Codex at the Future Law Conference at Stanford, which was kind of cool because then I could talk about how Jim Sandman inspired it, introduced it there. But I'd like to get all the law schools in the United States and then international law schools on here as well. So there's a link now on the page for law firms can submit innovations, but also law schools. I want them to sign up and talk about these classes they're teaching so we can get all law schools around the world really on this and get a sense for which schools are teaching things in these topic areas. So that's what I'm working on now. I want to update the catalog and want to get to the point of adding these different law schools to it. Questions or comments on this, or Any ideas on other ways to be measuring innovation in law firms? Oh,
I was what? No, okay, go ahead.
Have you found any correlation between the results of the firms in the regular rankings and the innovation index?
Yeah, I haven't really looked at it that closely. There have been some other people. One of the things that was, I launched it just before the school year started last year, and so I really haven't had a chance to look at the data as much as I would like to. It's just kind of like a visual kind of check, just like to see the reliability, validity check of it, that there did seem to be some correlation between firms that are kind of known as innovative. But that in of itself hasn't necessarily seemed to be a good predictor of whether they're profitable, right? So this is part of like where we feel like the ecosystem is changing, right? And when I talk about the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium, for example, so the buyers are changing their behavior, and so it'll be kind of interesting to see if some of these firms that are innovating, if they'll be rewarded for doing that. There's some evidence that maybe some of them are, but that's a little bit of an open question still.
And did you try to get some kind of client feedback from the firm? Because it's always the same, like that's what Legal 500 or Chambers do. I mean, it's very good what you as a law firm can be saying about how innovative you are, but at the end of the day, what is important is how you're considered by your clients.
Yeah. I mean, so I've had quite a few clients tell me that they want to use this information to try to figure out how to pick law firms, and I've talked to a lot of different clients about this, corporate legal departments. I mean, there are actually a couple of startup companies in the US now that are trying to do more like ranking. There's one called Qualmat that's been trying to get feedback on law firm performance. So there's some stuff happening in that space. But yeah, it'll be interesting to look at how this changes now too once I've done it, because a lot of people have kind of said, well, you can only do it once now because now these law firms are going to update their website. And so that will happen maybe to some extent, but there's some mitigating factors, because if you're the lawyer, you have to be careful how you represent yourself to your clients. You can't say, oh, we use artificial intelligence, and then not use it at all, because that would be, right, you'd be violating some of your duties to your clients in doing that. So there's some things to prevent the lawyers from going all out saying that. Maria?
No, I wanted to say, if you are considering that there are cultural factors that influences in communication, like for instance the Latin countries, we are normally less transparent and less used to the ranking system. The Anglo-Saxon countries are very used to comparison to giving information. Other countries don't like that so much, and in such a competitive environment, technology can be really a factor that differentiates and can invest in developing something very, say, original. I might not want to tell that to the world, but I might be the most innovative one. So how do you take that into consideration? Because I think that there is a big challenge. It might look like the Anglo-Saxon are the only ones who are innovating because of cultural factors, and secondly, there might be some very innovative and interesting things that are told, because I think, I'm not sure if it's happening, like really index so deeply, but I'm very afraid of marketing-based factors for rankings, because I know they depend on good marketing people.
Yeah.
So I think that, as Laura was saying, talking to the clients, not only to the clients in the business world, but also to consumers and potential users or the beneficiaries of the innovation, is also important. It's a challenge, and I don't know how to do it. It's key to have a real innovation ranking.
Yeah. Well, right, and doing it on a shoestring inside of a school, right? I didn't necessarily have the resources to do the surveying like that, but potentially that could be done. The question about, the market factor, and again, I do think there's some mitigating circumstances that the lawyers have to be a little bit careful about what they say, because they can't, make misrepresentations to their clients. It's an interesting question about the cultural factor. Of course, for this right now, I'm only looking at the Global 100, and most of those firms, well, there are a couple in other jurisdictions, right? So there's a Spanish firm called Tracasas is on here.
Is it the only Spanish one? Do you have in mind which Spanish firms you've
I don't. I think how many of them are in the glitter? It might be just
I
that
guess,
one.
yeah.
Or, yeah.
Garrigues, Cuatro Casas, Urilla.
Okay.
Probably the three, I guess.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I should go back and look. But so I hadn't really thought about, and this is something that a handful of law firms said though too in the U.S. Right? That well, we innovate for our client, we just don't broadcast it in some ways on our website. So.
And also a lot of innovation is coming from really tiny firms.
Sure.
Who don't have a marketing plan.
Yeah.
They don't have access to media, to other.
Yeah.
So
Well, they can come and click on the button here and they can submit their information and I'll put them on the end and they'll be in the catalog then, you know? So there you go. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, yes.
Just some thought, but which of all the listed innovation areas do you think have more potential to successfully develop short and long term?
Okay. Well, I think that's a good question. And this goes back to, it's interesting because, okay, how many people have read Clayton Christensen's Dilemma? Has anyone heard of Innovator's Dilemma, Clayton Christensen? Well, he talks a lot about disruptive innovation and these kind of new technologies and the incumbents being disrupted by these companies kind of like coming from the bottom and taking low-level work and then coming up in the marketplace. And so sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, oh, well, I'm not interested in, I don't care about process improvement and project management. I want disruption, give me robot lawyers. I want the really good stuff. And I don't know, my opinion is that I think that's a little bit of a mistake. And I think, of course, you'd be thinking about artificial intelligence and it has great potential to really have a huge impact on legal systems and the way we deliver legal services. However, the legal vertical, at least especially in the United States, is kind of a little bit different than other verticals because there's not been as much competition. And so if you look at the way legal services have been delivered, it's much more the same as what it was 100 years ago than different, right? So we haven't been improving. We haven't done the kind of things that you see in other verticals where there's been a lot of competition. So I really think it needs to kind of be a dual track strategy, kind of the idea of, we as lawyers, at least especially in the United States, I can speak to, right? You spend time billing hours and doing work, and seldom do you kind of stop and say, well, how am I doing? How do I improve my business, right? And so, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Agile, Scrum, project management, right? And part of Agile is doing a retrospective. Part of any good project management is doing a retrospective and stopping and saying, how am I doing? How are things going? Talking to your client. Start, stop, continue. Like, what's going well that we should keep doing? What's going poorly that we need to stop? What new things do we need to do to get better? And for the most part, lawyers, we don't have a history of doing that. So I think there's a lot of work to do to improve these things. And especially when you look at artificial intelligence, and we'll talk about this, I'd like to talk about this in just a second if we get to that, right? You look at what's happening in some of these other verticals, and the data, first of all, we don't have the massive amounts of data in the legal industry that they have. Like if you're Google, you've got billions of clicks, right? And we don't really have that kind of data in most places in law. And then the quality of the data as well, so particularly when you're talking about the service delivery. It tends to be that you get 10 lawyers who do one kind of work in ways, right? And it's hard to automate. You can't automate chaos, right? It's like, how do you use artificial intelligence to figure out what's going on when it's chaotic like that? So that I think the process improvement and project management and things like that, I think can really have a tremendous impact in the space. Now we're generalizing a lot too, right? And so I think the other thing is to get more sophisticated around some of these things. It's different if you're like a large global law firm versus a solo practitioner versus legal aid, or even some of the practices inside of even large law firms. It's very different if you're an employment lawyer versus if you're doing mergers and acquisitions, let's say. Because if you're an employment lawyer, there's quite a few now specialized employment law firms. So there's been a little bit more competition in getting people to think about data and using document automation, things like that.
So, what you mean work on the reporting us as a way of working?
What do you mean? Do you mean like?
The project management main methodologies to be applied to legal cases?
Yes.
Or just as a way of working inside the company?
Yeah. Well, I think it can really be both, and I think that it does. I mean, when I litigated, I saw great potential for applying project management principles, thinking about how the work gets done, what information people need, the sequences and dependencies, thinking about a communication plan, when I'm going to let my client, give my client updates. And so I think there's lots of good reasons to apply. Mergers and acquisitions, right? That's very sophisticated work frequently, but lots and lots of project management. So even with just on the law part of it, many opportunities for better project management. And just like related back to the last question too, I think on the artificial intelligence is the analytics and just getting more data driven. Sometimes I'll have lawyers, they'll say, when I was a litigator, I did the same thing, right? And it's like, I go to my client, oh, I'm the best, hire me, I'm the best, okay? Well, how much is it going to cost? And how's it going to turn out? Oh, who knows? And, like, no idea. It's like, well, what are you doing? You're the best, I thought. Why don't you know? Like, and I did. So even if we don't have big data, why don't we capture small data? And so if I can say to the client, well, the last 10 times I did it, it cost this much, and this is how it turned out, right? And so capturing those metrics and having some data can help distinguish. And then when you start capturing the data for automation and other artificial intelligence tools, things like that inside of organizations. A lot of the data we have is messy, noisy, garbage in, garbage out kind of quality data too. That's one of the problems. So really thinking about becoming data-driven inside of organizations. So I think, artificial intelligence has the potential to have a really big impact on the legal industry, but I think you can't overlook a lot of these other categories. And then you can get a great return on a lot of these other categories in the near term.
And do you see a relation between the innovation index for firms and the ones for universities? Geographically, or at some point do you see some kind of relation between the two?
I'm not so sure. I don't think so, but I haven't really looked at that and pushed too hard. I don't know that there is. That'd be something interesting to look at.
Yeah.
We should have a hackathon here and we can get the data and
Or we should bring all the universities together. I know there's people here from universities and try to see who innovates more. And do you have the feeling that this is changing the university point of view? I mean, now I guess all the universities are preparing or finishing for next year.
I mean, it's hard to, this change has been happening, but I know there are a lot of law schools where, like I know just even my own work that I was doing at Michigan State, it was very challenging to try to find out, well, who's teaching these classes? You find out and you can go to your faculty and say, oh, well, hey, how about this class? Harvard teaches it and Stanford teaches it. If it's good enough for Harvard and Stanford, maybe it's good enough for us, right? So that is helpful. And so I think that, it's hard to say that there's a causal relationship there. I think this is just one effort. I think other people trying to get information out there instead of reinventing the wheel. Any other questions or comments?
Would you consider for future years using actual submissions, like applications from law firms instead of their website, so that you sort out, the market?
Yeah. I would like to potentially, one of the things I'm going to grapple with right now is like, how much do I want to work with this and do with this, right? Do I want to turn it into like my life's work kind of like thing, or do I want to just kind of, but I think absolutely, and I've talked to some folks about trying to set it up in a way that law firms could, because I think there's other objective measures. For example, if you say that you're committed to project management, how many project managers do you have in your law firm? If you have 1,000 lawyers and 2 project managers, then it doesn't sound like you're very committed to project management. Same thing around knowledge management and some of these other categories I think you could ask questions about as well. So I think there's a lot of data that could be gathered to give some insight. And a lot of it is being gathered, but it's being gathered in pockets by corporate legal departments, right? In the RFPs that they send to law firms. And I think it'd be useful to make some of that transparent.
The way they bill, for example. it would make sense to see how many of these firms still bill per hour, or what
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
structure they
Yeah.
can invent.
Yeah, yeah. And there are some other surveys in the United States too that capture some data about that. But those also, some of them tend to be expensive to access the data and things like that as well too. So it's hard to get your hands on. Any other comments or questions? Oh, so should I go to the other one, or, okay. All right, so this other one, this is a very much a draft, kind of, and I wanted to talk maybe just a little bit about, I don't know if people are going to participate in this question, but how many people feel like they have a good understanding of what is artificial intelligence, at least discussed about, yeah? Yeah. How would you describe it? Like, what would you say is, like,
artificial intelligence was a technology that started in 1984. Was driven by Digital Equipment Corporation. Was the first step in order to introduce the enterprise the algorithm, all the process that they have automatized in the defense in order to introduce to the enterprise. Now, 33 years after, the speeds and also the algorithms, Google has changed a lot between artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, and also, this technology was implemented in the algorithm training. So they have implemented a lot of process of the high frequency trading and a lot of algorithms. So there is a lot of different scenarios. After this speech, in order to improve the workflow, artificial intelligence is the tool in order to improve and to introduce the intelligence in the clerical or administrative tasks that usually is 80% of all the tasks in a lawyer firm. So
with artificial intelligence, you can automate that, you think? Is that what you're saying?
So one of the part of the artificial intelligence, so this is the machine learning, the chatbot, in order to introduce, it's the same like the manufacturing with the robots. So you have manual and you introduce all the algorithms in one machine that make this, all the things are equal and they haven't any trouble, any problem. So artificial intelligence is in a lot of cases to introduce the knowledge, the expertise of one person, one person inside one algorithm, one machine.
Well, so I think, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I think one of the questions that some people raise about artificial intelligence as well is whether rules-based systems still qualify as artificial intelligence. And you know, I don't know if it matters if you call it artificial intelligence or not, but a lot of the tools that are being developed right now are rules-based systems in the legal industry. Well, so I have a few slides just kind of giving some examples of artificial intelligence. And so I think it would be useful. Now, this is very 50,000-foot level, but unless, people are going to object that that's too, they want to just skip past that, I think I'll go through these, and so maybe it'll be helpful. So I just want to talk about some examples, and then I want to talk a little bit. One of the things I'm very interested in is to start, I think there's a need for some discussion about how do we evaluate artificial intelligence tools, both from a societal perspective, just thinking about how are these tools being used in society generally, but then also just from a perspective of lawyers and law firms and thinking about, okay, well, someone's trying to sell me something, usually these are pretty expensive, what are the right questions to ask to evaluate some of these tools? What are the right metrics to have in place for them? So at its simplest, artificial intelligence is just intelligence demonstrated by a machine. There's no natural law around this. It is whatever we want it to be, right? So there's a lot of debate on whether certain things are or not artificial intelligence, but that's kind of, there's some reasons why maybe that's important. But when it comes down to it, I think it's probably easier to talk about machine learning or deep learning or rules-based systems, symbolic systems, things like that, because then it's very concrete what you're talking about, whether rather than kind of how you might classify something. This is kind of like a breakdown. Nick Bostrom writes about this, as do quite a few other people, but he kind of coined this phrase, super general intelligence. But what we really have right now is narrow AI, right? This is an important, get a little bit exercised about, concerned about this area, which, now, I wouldn't dismiss it, but we're not there yet. We're still in the narrow AI space. So this is a map from Neota Logic. And so you noticed before, I kind of had a separate section for expert systems. These are those rules-based tools, right? Like if, then, else logic to deliver service. And I think this is a good example, too, of where I think if you push on what lawyers do, how much of what we do, if you thought about it, could you code in if, then, else logic, right? You ask a question, and you know the answer, like you can figure out branching down the decision tree, getting to the right answer. And in fact, we're seeing more and more expert systems just based on can be built using if and else type of rules-based logic. Machine learning is very popular. We're seeing a lot of applications of that. Natural language processing, of course, also. So being able to talk into your phone and have it put the text out and understand. Speech recognition is very good right now. Natural language processing is starting to get pretty good as well, right? And we're seeing a lot of different tasks. I'm going to focus mostly on machine learning just as we walk through this, right? And one of the things that are important that sometimes people don't understand around this, the idea that you can create a rules-driven system and it's deterministic. You know what it's going to do, right? If you so we talk in the U.S. a lot about TurboTax. For a lot of how many people are familiar with TurboTax? I guess apparently it's not a popular item here in Spain, but creating these rules where you put in information and it kind of walks you through. You don't need to be a lawyer. You don't really need to know the tax code because these rules have been set up to be able to help walk you through. It's deterministic to get you to an answer. The data in artificial intelligence that we're talking about, it's really probabilistic. It's like there's predictions being, right? So we know that there's going to be an error rate. It's never going to be 100% accurate, right? We're making predictions really about the future based on patterns that we've seen in the past. And so if you start thinking about it, this is where the weakness is, I think, we were talking about earlier, right? If you're Google and you've got billions of records of data, it's a little bit easier to predict, make predictions about different things, like what person buys this book, what other book are they going to want to buy, or a person, like when you type into Google and start searching, right, and it knows what you're searching for and all that data it has. And in the legal industry, we really don't have that kind of data. And then reinforcement learning, and this is, I'll give a short example about this later on, but this has been one way that people have found to get away from not having a lot of data. So most of this is based on having data, but so the original version of AlphaGo was data from games to Go. AlphaGo 0, they essentially gave it the rules and let the program play itself to learn mistakes so that it could know all the correct moves to make in the game Go. Okay. Now, what's your age? And you can figure out, right, questions and to figure out kind of what the outcome is. So we're seeing more and more rules-based happening. Many people call that artificial intelligence. So if you have an incident with data, kind of putting in information and telling you where you need to make notifications. And it's all based on rules-driven technology. All right, so data-driven artificial intelligence, okay, right? So now we're seeing more and more machine learning and deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning, and that's where we've really had some breakthroughs in the last few years is in deep learning. In the AI space, usually what you do is you see machine learning broken down in these different ways, and I'll give some examples of this. But so the idea is to be thinking a categorical is like putting it into different buckets. So like a spam filter is really a machine learning tool. And you can put it in two buckets, either spam or it's not spam. They call it sometimes spam and then ham is the good stuff, right? And so now that is actually a supervised system because the user is going to market, is going to label it, right? So we have labeled data. We train the system by telling it, this is what spam looks like. This is what ham looks like. Now you figured out when another email comes in, right, is it going to, which category to drop it into. I just showed regression analysis, right? You can think of supervised machine learning, like basically regression analysis, and the only point there is that you're not categorizing things, but you could be like values, you could be predicting someone's salary, it could be 0 to infinity, right, with salary. And then unsupervised, right, all of this is where we're talking about labeled data. And that's like when I was talking before about Google having millions of data sets. When someone starts typing into the search bar and it starts predicting, well, it's because they've got labeled data. They know that when people type 3 letters in sequence, they know what that 4th letter is going to be, right? Google, it's got all that data. But we also have unsupervised learning, and you know, there's some areas in the law where we're seeing some of that being used. So you can think like if you had a large corpus of documents, you might want to use some sort of an unsupervised clustering algorithm to get it to kind of divide out the documents, the different kinds of types. Maybe you could recognize non-disclosure agreements and other types of agreements or something like that. Or you could tell it to kind of cluster into 5 different groups or something like that. So here's, again, the example of SPAM, right, for supervised categorical classification task, right? The human is labeling the data, telling it what it looks like. And of course, when you're using Gmail or something like that, the spam filter is really good now on programs like Gmail because, again, huge data sets, massive amounts of data. You could think about, for regression analysis, like predicting the value of a home. If you have a large data set, this would be considered labeled data. If you know the square footage, right, or square meters, and then the price, you could plot a regression line, and then a new example comes along, and you say, oh, it's 2,000 square feet. You would predict, you'd go right up the line and say, well, I predict this is going to be the value of it, right? So using all of this as probabilities to make predictions about the future, spotting these patterns and making predictions. The clustering that I talked about, right, so you could put in a bunch of data, and the algorithm would look for different patterns and sort out the data for you. Right? So that's an example of unsupervised categorical clustering. So we encounter machine learning now all the time, more and more, right? On our phones, you buy a book on Amazon, it recommends other books to you. You watch a movie on Netflix, it recommends all these other movies to you, right? So based on what all the other people are doing on these different platforms, then it learns from you as well. Starts fixing itself. We're seeing in law, like I talked about earlier, right? So a lot of technology-assisted review, e-discovery, diligence, compliance, but now we're starting to see more and more like in litigation matters. How can we use that data to predict outcomes in cases? If we know who the judge is, who the parties are, or different information about the lawsuits, can we make predictions? So if you have a data set where you've got a bunch of cases and you know the outcomes, they're labeled, you have a new case come in, you have features, right? And if we were thinking in stats class, it'd be like variables, you might call them, but features, we talk about machine learning. If you know those features, then you can make a prediction using the algorithm that you have that you train with that labeled data. All right, so technology, is anyone familiar with e-discovery or doing any e-discovery work? Or a couple, yeah. Right, so and then this is where, law firms, you could have armies of associates reviewing documents, but now more and more what they found is that you train an algorithm, you put it in buckets, relevant, not relevant. The algorithm gets trained, and this has been proven out, and I'll talk about this in just a couple minutes, that this is better than human review in almost all, and in most cases, right, it's been proven to be better than human review. And we've got better and better continuous learning systems and things like that where, and it's not surprising to be better than humans, right? If your job is you're just 10 hours a day looking at documents trying to figure out what's relevant or not relevant, humans make mistakes, right? The computer doesn't make mistakes doing this kind of work. And no one really wants to do this kind of work, right? If you went to law school, you want to be helping clients, not reviewing thousands of documents for hours and hours a day. Here's an example, right? This is an example of something that corporate legal departments in the United States are doing. Gathering data, this was Metrics did this. Like if you knew the size of the firm, where they're located, the partner status, experience, practice area, can you predict what their billable hour rate is, right? And it turns out that you can, right? You can put together a regression model of it. So you've got a constant, and then you know for these different features, these different variables, how much of an impact they're going to have on your prediction, right? So you've got a basic algorithm, you put in the information. Metrics actually had an app, right? You could put in, like, so it was Chicago, you want a mergers and acquisition partner in a 1,000-lawyer firm with 30 years of experience, right? You put that in, and it'll tell you based on the data that it already has, it makes a prediction that that person should charge $758 an hour. Right? So thinking about how you can use data like that to continue to make predictions. If you had a whole set, again, of case outcomes, you can make predictions in cases like that. Okay, so, and again, I'm just talking about this from a 50,000 foot level, and hopefully you'll take something away from this, but part of the idea of doing this is that by talking about this, you need to hear it multiple times, you start learning a little bit more about it every time you hear it, and then over time, right, it's kind of, you start getting a good grasp of it. Okay, so deep learning, right, so a lot of the progress that we're hearing that's been made is deep, and deep learning, neural networks have actually been around for a long time. But now, today, we have a lot more computational power and much more data, and that's why we've been seeing a lot more progress in machine learning tasks using deep learning. And so the idea is it's inspired by the way we believe the brain works, right? So this idea that if you're on and you have different inputs, whether it's low, and then you get an output from the neuron. And so how do you create a network and kind of create many layers of this that are interconnected? And you kind of think about what are the weights between these different, it's like each one is its own model inside of it, and you tie it together. Now, one of the challenges you start having with this is it starts getting very opaque, and you lose explainability. And even the people who build these, they can't really tell you why it's doing what it's doing. They can just tell you if it's getting things right or not. Okay? That's one of the problems that people are trying to overcome. But you've probably seen maybe on Facebook or a lot of other places like the facial recognition. It's kind of creepy, right? I mean, that we don't recognize people. And they're doing this with deep learning, with these neural networks, right? These many layers that are picking up on different features of the images, right? And then they're training these, they tune these, and then there's this recursive effect, right, where they figure out when they get the right answer or the wrong answer, and they keep improving the model to get better outcomes as you go through it. And again, just to highlight, like you're seeing all of us, I mean, probably are 100% sure that's a cat, right? Okay, well, the way these deep learning networks work, right, is they're probabilistic, right? And it basically makes an estimate, usually is the way they're working. So it's 90% certain that it's a cat. But there's some examples here. There's like this is a one that people talk about as like the challenges presented for some of these systems. And for humans, it takes a second, right? It tricks you, but probably most of us would get 100%. We'd be able to tell it's a muffin or it's a chihuahua, right? But there's more mistakes made in different instances like this. And that's not that surprising, but I was just wanting to go through a couple, right? And so even some of these best systems, this is a cool kind of chatbot where you can feed images to it, and it tells you, when you feed the image, it tells you what it sees, right? And the one that's pinned there is a dinosaur on top of a surfboard. And I mean, this is pretty good, right? So someone uploaded this picture, and it said, oh, a group of football players on a field. Good, right? Audrey Hepburn, I don't know if people know Audrey Hepburn, right? The like famous U.S. actress, right? So there's a lot of pictures of Audrey Hepburn, and so there, it gets that right, it knows it. A statue of a person. Okay, that's pretty good, right? It picked up and knew that's a statue, not an actual person. Okay, not bad. A bridge over water. Okay, that seems pretty good, right? Be able to predict this stuff. A wooden bench in front of a house. Okay, not really, right? And you look at it and you think, okay, I kind of understand how it got tripped up, right? Maybe like getting on sauces, different contrast, contours, and it got messed up on that. A group of people looking at a phone, right? Now this helps highlight one of the problems, right? It's looking for patterns, it's seeing patterns, and it's been trained that in 2018, if you saw people looking down, well, they're probably all looking at a phone, right? But not in 1970, they weren't looking at phones, right? When the picture was taken. So this is an anachronistic kind of explanation of what's going on there that really misses the mark, right? A flock of sheep grazing on a lush green field, being like, no, I don't know about seeing sheep there, right? So somehow maybe it thinks the houses are sheep, right? A herd of sheep standing on top of a metal fence, right? Now that one is kind of like, okay, well, there's no herd of sheep, like there's a saddle or something, and like no human, of course, would say, oh, there's a herd of sheep on top of a metal fence, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? A person sitting in a garden. Not really, not quite. Right? Now, of course, this is a little bit unfair, right? Because I'm picking some of the worst examples, but the truth is this technology is going to keep getting better and better, and you'll see fewer and fewer of these mistakes. But it's a little bit scary, right? Because these algorithms are opaque, and we don't really know why is it making these mistakes. And so you don't really kind of know, well, when's the next mistake that it's going to make, when it's not going to, you know, that there isn't going to be the data, the pattern that it's going to find that's going to match up to what we expect it to. Okay, so I want to go back and talk about that in just a second, because what I want to talk about is kind of like, if we learn about these, the way these tools work a little bit, if we want to start using them, what kind of questions should we ask of these different vendors if they're trying to sell them? They start having an impact in other places, so I just thought I'd talk about it. So you think you have a mouse, and we need to get the mouse to the cheese, right? So could you set up a machine, basically, to figure out all the different paths to take, and through reinforcement learning, kind of. And so basically, is mapping all these different, every possible move that it can potentially make across that maze, right? So it can go through this. I mean, for a human being, it would take a long time to map out all these different possibilities. You can use this through reinforcement learning, and then basically, once you can tell the rule of the game, then you know, no matter where, every spot on this board, you know what the optimum move is, right? And so you can think of different things like Game of Go, again, was impacted by that. You can think about other situations in the world kind of where, through learning like this, you can solve problems. Okay, so how do we assess AI tools? Okay, so there's been a fair amount of work around technology-assisted review for e-discovery. First started coming out, I remember when I was practicing at Honickman, and a lot of people said, oh, you know, judges are not going to approve this. This is going to never is going to happen. They're going to trust humans, right? And actually, it didn't take very long that the judges in the United States had started approving it, and it was through science, right? They did studies, they looked at it, they started figuring out kind of how to measure the progress for these e-discovery tools. It became accepted, and now they're very well accepted. We haven't quite gotten there yet with machine learning, and one of the things that we're seeing in other spaces, and one of the things that we're seeing is that there's some, you know, and this is, you know, I don't want this to be taken out of context, but there are some problems around the way machine learning is starting to develop. You just think about one of the things that makes science is the fact that experiments are reproducible. If someone says, you know, I ran this experiment and these are the results I got, they should publish enough information that any one of us could run the experiment and see, or it should be reproducible, right? Well, it's very difficult to reproduce these machine learning experiments, and there's been a lot of criticism the way some of these tools are being built, where like there's a benchmark out there, like the photos are a good one, right? And if you get X percentage of photos right, if you can do just 1% better, then you get recognition, you get a paper published about it, but you might not be able to explain what the heck it is that you get. Right? So that's kind of a problem, especially if you want to have explainable tools, especially from a lawyer's point of view. If you want to understand how these things work, there's science around the way that these tools are being developed. How many people saw this when this came up? This LawGeeks robots versus, or humans versus machines article. Anyone? A couple of people I see nodding about this, right? Some people criticize this. I thought it was actually kind of a good thing that to have a company start trying to set some benchmarks around, well, how these tools work, right? And so they set up a little bit of a study. Now you can, the extent to which the study was valid, because the way it was basically reviewing disclosure agreements. And so they had this artificial intelligence tool. They said that they had trained it on thousands of non-disclosure agreements. And so they set up some individuals to review them. And so if you're reviewing a non-disclosure agreement, there's certain things you would look for and flag, and then you'd maybe tell your client, oh, we should renegotiate this. We don't want to agree to this or that. So they trained our AI. They ran the agreements through there, and then they gave them to humans to mark up and try to mark it. Now, the way it was done was maybe not the way you would do it as a practicing lawyer, because they like had it in Excel and different. So there's maybe some questions about that. But what they came out with is that the LawGeeks performed 94%, found 94% of the provisions, but for the humans it was a little bit lower, it's 85%, right? Now, it's interesting that they say accuracy level here, because I think there's a question about accuracy and if that's the right term or not. We'll see that they actually did use recall and precision. And I'll talk about that in just a second, what that is and why you want to use recall and precision. Especially like if you're in an area, like so let's say you're creating a tool for medical professionals and 1 person out of 1,000,000 gets some sort of a cancer, and you have to create an algorithm to predict whether that person has cancer. Well, if only 1 person in 1,000,000 gets it, if you just say, no, no one ever gets it, then you'll get it right 999,999 times, but wrong just once. So your accuracy is not, you're 99.99% accurate, right? But you never predict the thing that you care about. So we don't want to look for accuracy, we look for recall and precision when we're looking at these. And then, so here's what they did, right? They looked at, so this idea of, here, let me go to this slide, right? So there's this idea, like, and this applies, you can think about for information retrieval, and so like if you're using Google, you could use this for Google to see like what kind of results you get back, right? I mean, it's either a positive or a negative, or it's not, right? So, like this is thinking about the review of documents, whether something is relevant or not. So if you say that basically the red ones are the ones that you want to get back, okay? You could, again, get all of them by just saying, well, give me everything, right? And so you have perfect recall, you've obtained everyone that you want, all the red ones, but you have low precision because you have a bunch of blue ones in here that you didn't want to have. The opposite end of that is you get perfect precision. So what you're really trying to do is balance the two of them, right? It's never going to be perfect. The idea of balancing precision and recall. So that's how you calculate it, and that's how you have a number, then you compare across different tools. And so this is definitely the kind of statistic that we should be asking these different legal terms, and that's how you calculate it, and that's how you have a number, then you compare across different tools. And so this technology companies to produce, right? I think we should have more studies like this, looking at these different studies to figure out what kind of, how to evaluate. Has anyone put much thought into thinking about how to evaluate different tools like this, like LogGeeks, Luminance, and all these different tools, ROS?
I think the best way to evaluate is as clients again.
Yeah?
The problem is that it's difficult if you have invested in such a tool to declare that,
Yeah.
well, there is always the excuse that you are not feeding it properly.
Yeah.
So I think that at least what I'm hearing now on Saturday, by coincidence, I was with somebody who had Luminance.
Yeah.
And apparently it's not working very well.
Yeah.
But, who's going to know about it? Because for a law firm declaring I have made so much investment in this, and maybe it is confirmed itself because it's not feeding the machine properly. I mean, there are many.
Yeah, doesn't sound like a very good business model, blaming your client for it. But
the learning curve is now, I think, for artificial intelligence. If you buy this kind of machines, you have to realize that there is a risk there, and you have to assume.
I think the problem is that it's still also expensive, that you would, of course, try several if you could. I mean, this is, for example, the case I'm with. I mean, just to try it and to do the big proof of concept, you're not going to dedicate all your efforts to doing it once and then a second time. I mean, you don't have resources for that. So you're just very partial, and you need to exchange with other people who've been trying, but it's never going to be precisely the same situation. So I guess we need the technology to be...
And you never know if it is your fault or machine fault. I mean, now I think that the people who are selling these kind of tools, and I'm not only talking about sophisticated tools where I think there is no risk and we are assuming, I'm talking about simple tools. I think they should be more realistic about the state of the machine. They should just really classify, and maybe we have to work on that. Like, which are the different phases? Like, what is a beta? And what is a fully complete legal thing? So maybe we have to work in that kind of ranking, A beta is more than clients, a beta is that these clients have declared that they're fully satisfied, a beta is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
they're working on that to help, and
Yeah.
then you get stars, something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
All these, in my opinion, all these tools, such luminance or ROS and stuff, they are okay in the sense that they have found vertical to the law firms. Law firms might consume all these solutions, but at the end of the day, is also commodity in the sense that there are all solutions to buy, check, or try in your law firm. Perhaps they work, perhaps they don't. They need training of the lawyers. Again, you have to train your lawyers to adapt to the tool instead of the tool being adapted to the lawyer, which is the interesting, work. In my opinion, I think that these tools, they might be okay. I mean, they work. They work, but they don't make any difference between law firms, because all the law firms go to buy them or go to get the subscription of all these tools, but it's not, they don't make any difference in the market. I mean, at the end of the day, it might, again, be a commodity. You buy it, you use it, you deliver to your customer. I think that all, perhaps because in the law firms, they need change of mindset. I mean, stop thinking about the art of the law and start thinking of a technological company. Instead of being a law firm, it has to be a technical or technology company, which is another thing. Because one of the things, or the threats I can see with all this artificial intelligence is entrepreneurs using artificial to work for technology companies instead of working on their own businesses.
Just say they don't need lawyers at all. Do not
No,
pay.
you do.
Chatbot, right?
You do. I mean, I don't think in a robot lawyer, as a human, but I do believe in the robot law firm, which is another thing. And of course, we need lawyers, and we need the art of law.
Of course we need lawyers.
Of course. And lawyers, we always be there.
I'm a lawyer, I believe. I mean, but I guess
But
there's a question.
there are many tasks and many stuff that you can do by your own, or perhaps it's a very cheap service.
Yeah.
So of course there will be lawyers always. They are very need for, and they are very important social agents. But there are many lawyers that will end up instead of their own business. Is what I can see.
I mean, I believe in lawyers. I'd like to do that. I wish lawyers. I think there's many opportunities for lawyers to do a lot more, to add more value for society and for their clients. I think they have a lot of work to do to live up to that.
Perhaps because I'm a lawyer, interested for trying lawyers to develop their, and we see that they are not entrepreneurs in that sense.
Yeah.
So that's why perhaps it's a little bit frustrating in that way.
Yeah.
The problem with luminance, I think it's pretty developed in the UK. In the own words of a partner here in Spain, of Juan Lawrence, he said to me that they don't want to be the first to feed the program. So other one take advantage of the knowledge they feed. So I think this is the first problem that with the implementation of this kind of technology in Spain.
Yeah, the language.
They don't want to be the first because the software, the intelligence is not tested here in Spain, and they want some more research developed before they adopt the technology. This is the first problem, and the second problem is the public institutions. I think. I'm a project manager, and we always look for restrictions. And I think the first restriction that there is in Spain is the public policies and all the administration, the slow they manage the justice here. So why bothering implementing technology? So there is another restriction that is going to stop me from giving good service to the client. I think this is something that is in the mind of the lawyers. Why adopting a system? So I'm not going to get any advantage from the system because the good service to the client.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I have some questions that because I think going back to what some of the, like, so if you're trying to buy this, just like if you buy a used car, right, like, have you heard of like caveat emptor, right, like buyer beware, and like, so when you buy things, if you don't ask the right questions, then, now I'm not saying that's exactly the way it applies here, but how do we, if we want to buy these tools, become more sophisticated consumers? Like, if we understand how they work, and we understand like these problems, how do we make sure we ask the right questions? And this is just very, very rough draft. So like for the millions of people who are going to watch on YouTube, right? Okay, so and really I looked at a couple of, I mean, there's lots of articles written in around this space, but I found quite a few of these examples in the Goodfellow Deep Learning book, which if you're interested in deep learning, it's a free book that's available online. And then Muriel Hillebrand wrote a book, an article in which she talked about a couple of these, right? And so, and I'd love to hear people's input on this and if they think there are other ideas, right? And actually, I just put this together this afternoon. I have a bunch of articles about this, but what level of performance is required, right? So that's, I mean, some of these tools, maybe they'll never be accurate enough to make a difference. Now, I think sometimes what we do, and this is what happened in e-discovery, we see the technology tool and we say, oh, no, we can't use it unless it's perfect, right? It's got to be perfect or we can't use it. I'm a lawyer, right? It's like, well, wait a second, the way that we're doing is perfect, right? So that we have to set a baseline and figure out, well, what's the quality of the work we're doing already? So that we should be evaluating this based on the quality of the work that gets done by the humans in that space. One of the majority of these pictures that I was showing, it's pretty clear, right? A cat or a dog, like, there's not a lot of disagreement. But if I say, you can think about different things, like when you're talking about an e-discovery, is this relevant or not relevant? Well, lawyers would disagree, right? So how do you figure out, well, how do you get it right? Who determines what's getting it right? And you can think about how that applies like in the justice system as well, too, right? Not just like legal services. The precision versus recall trade-offs, right? So how are you going to balance that? And you got to think about that, right? Because like when we go back to, like when I was talking about if it's a matter of health, would you rather that there be a false negative or a false positive, right? Well, if it's going to give you if it's a disease that's treatable, if detected, well then you'd rather there be false positives, right? Because you don't want to risk that someone has it and you miss it. You'd rather have there be false positives because you detect something, you can treat it, right? And you've got to make those same sort of decisions for these different tools. At what point, how do you balance between precision and recall? Usually the way you build these models, we didn't talk about this, right? But like, so if you're training luminance or something else, like or this LogX tool, you maybe have 1,000 records of data, labeled data. You'll divide it into two sets, a training set and then a test set. So then you train your algorithm over with your training data, and then the first pass, you'd probably run it against your training set just to see, well, what kind of performance do we get? And then you take it and run it against this test set, the reserved data that you have, and see how it does there. So you could ask questions, right? How did it do when you trained it? When you ran it against the training set, how did it do when you ran it against the test set? How many times did you segment the data to do your testing and training of the algorithm? What's the quality of the training data? Right? Asking, of course, if you're in Spain and you're reviewing Spanish documents and you want to say, well, how many Spanish documents did you use to train this system, right? And how are English documents? Like, what did you learn from all this other training you've done? What sort of data. Yeah? See?
Yes.
Okay. So is it noisy? Does it have the right inputs? Right? I think that's another question. We may have a lot of data, but if you're trying to predict something, do you have actually the right features? Are you capturing the right information to be able to predict the things that you want to predict? Maybe some of these tools that you're talking about, they're just not capturing the right data to ever be able to get the quality outcome that you need because they don't have the right inputs. How much training data do they have to build the model? And then if they're going to blame the customer, like Maria and Laura, you were saying, right? I mean, if they say, well, you need the training, you don't have enough data, well, how much data do I need to have before it works the way that I need it to work? And they should be able to have, they should be able to give you a curve where they can show basically the amount of data and then the error rate declining and be able to tell you, oh, if you need X performance, then here's how much data you need. They should be able to tell you that, right? You should be able to ask them, they should be able to tell you that. How does their training data differ from the live environment? Okay? So if you did stuff on e-discovery, you may have trained systems on the Enron data set from, gosh, I don't know how many years ago it is now, 25 years ago or something like that. So if you have a system and then you want to put it in the live environment today, well, you'd expect that, probably not going to function as well as it did on the, you're doing it used on old data. Is it representative? Right? We see a lot of problems. There's a lot of talk about bias. That's a big concern with a lot of these AI tools. If you created something and it's just a bunch of white guys that they built the system on, well, then it's going to be biased. It's not going to work when when women use it, for example, right? And all the other ways in which it can be not representative of the population, be it documents or human beings, what have you. Is the sample biased, right? Is it oversampling from certain groups, undersampling from other groups? Are there biased labels, right? So if you're creating something, this could happen there's certainly situations in the justice system for lawyers, right? But the labeling that went in the beginning, if it captures some sort of bias or discrimination to begin with, well, then you're training the system to perpetuate that bias, right? To continue that. So this may be less than, and maybe innocuous in some sense, where it's just like identifying something in documents, or it could be something that affects people, affects human beings. What kind of testing data that they have? What is the cost of collecting more data? Right? And that would be part of the question you want to ask in the evaluation process, because usually with these tools, there's not a lot of playing around with algorithms so much. It's usually a data play. More data, the system works better. Asking what is the data acquisition cost going to be? And you want to evaluate that and figure that out up front before you buy something. When you collect more data, what's the expected effect on data? I talked about that. You can plot the relationship. How much is required, and then this idea of explainability, transparency, auditability, right? When the algorithm does something, when it suggests something, can you see why? Why did it suggest something? Is there auditability, and do we know why certain inputs generate certain outputs? So I don't know.
Do you think that all these questions might be answered by lawyers?
Well, I think the lawyers need to ask the questions of the vendors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing is that's why but even like that, do you think that are there many lawyers that might think of these kind of questions?
Well, that's why we should have a hackathon and we should create the perfect checklist. And then we just give it to every lawyer, and then they can give it to the technologists and make them fill it out, right? Yeah. And inside the law firms, of course, it shouldn't be just the lawyers. It should be technologists and other people working together asking these questions. But yeah, I think that that's the other thing, is it's difficult to assess these systems if you don't understand how they work. Yeah. And it'll be harder and harder when they get more technical. You'll need more and more technical expertise to really go through an assessment like this.
I think it would really be interesting to do this because it seems like so resources consuming and time consuming. I don't know how a law firm could go through all this for different platforms or tools. Once you've tested it.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree. So one of the things, well, two parts to that. Side of the university, at Northwestern this fall, I'm going to teach a class, Artificial Intelligence and Legal Reasoning. I'd like to do more analysis of this and start maybe analyzing tools and things like that.
And gather experts in both tech and law. And,
yes, exactly. Yes, so more than just lawyers looking at it, right? So I think that's part of it. I think, though, that part of this is also just like we talked about M&A before, right? And when you do a deal, you don't necessarily, you investigate and they give you some data, but you also ask for representations and warranties, right? And so you would think about, if you're your vendor, you would say, hey, here are all the questions, give me the information. So the vendor should be able to supply this. And at some point, I talked about the logging study, I would hope at some point, like, because we're just having their website, here's how we built it. Now some of that's proprietary, but it's not all proprietary. They should be disclosing more of this information.
I guess when we have more tools like this, Logix will just not do human against machine. It will be human against this machine and this machine and this machine, and let's see.
I think there is a growing amount of work around this. I think there's a need for more of. I'd like to write something about it, but this is just the beginning, right, of thinking about the questions that need to be asked to evaluate these different tools.
You know what, I think that now, at the moment, we are at a stage where there is discussion about if there should be a legal framework for artificial intelligence. This legal framework could determine the amount of transparency, the amount of explainability, accountability, etc.
Yeah.
We still don't know what is going to happen, but that is very relevant, and I don't think that there is enough discussion on that. The discussion now is whether there should be an ethical framework or a legal framework. Maybe the answer is there should be an ethical and legal framework, and I think that's key to answer part of what you have there.
Yeah.
I think we have to wait and see. What I noticed is that in the last weeks, I'm seeing Microsoft and Google just did it today, I think.
Yeah.
Today, I copied the news. So they are saying, these are my ethics. And they will have 7 principles that they consider to be an answer to explainability, transparency, accountability, etc.
Yeah.
Is that enough? For the legal sector, because we are talking about the legal sector, not about financial, medical. Should the different sectors have different frameworks, legal, ethical frameworks? These are the questions.
Yeah, well, I'm just looking at this from buying technology, but I think there's a lot of overlap for all these other questions, like how might this be used in the justice system, for healthcare, all these different areas. So you can see, like, there's general principles that ought to govern across this whole space. And we shouldn't wait. The lawyers should be in front of this. We should be driving this as
I'm
lawyers.
already in front of that. But I think it makes quite a difference. You are just saying, if it is for the for judicial purposes, police purposes, I think it's very risky business. If it is for a law firm, if the outcome of the IE is not the right one, I'm sorry for the law firm, it's not affecting human rights, which I think are the key, in my opinion, based in ethics, should be.
Talking about this, some will say, oh, they're going to be doing this in courts someday. I'm like, they're already doing it in courts. What are you talking about? Like, we need to understand this stuff.
Do the products that you have tried offer auditability? Because what I've heard from different products is that you cannot see, like, you get a result, but you cannot see the algorithm behind it, or why it produced that result. So
yeah, I think that's the case for most of them, that there's not a lot of transparency with most of them. Yeah, and maybe in some areas that's okay, right? Especially if it's e-discovery or something like that, okay? If it's deciding who goes to prison and who gets set free, like, well, maybe we need to know. Right?
Which is something you already use in the States, which still seems for us in Spain like far-fetched, but if I'm not mistaken, is it courts and police using already AI tools to make a decision?
Yeah.
And I've heard...
No, but to
Sensing or risk of recidivism and things like that. Yeah, I'm not an expert in this area. I know it's being used. It's been upheld. Like there was a lot written about this tool Compass that was being used.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting on the one hand that this is being used and there's not a lot of transparency around
and
it.
it's supposed to be biased. There has been something.
Yeah, well, there's kind of mixed reviews of that too, right? And this is where it's a little bit dangerous too. That lawyers, maybe some of them who didn't, maybe there are a bunch of criminologists who said that it's not read up on that particular problem, right? There's transparency, and we don't really know. And when there should be, you would think there would be some sort of a body or someone who would say, be able to create some standards around how those tools are going to be used that we would have. Because one of the concerns that I have is that if we don't get in front of this, I think using these tools responsibly, you can get better outcomes. You can reduce discrimination and bias in systems, right? So if you use them responsibly, the kind of thing that it'd be easy to get lots of people behind, because even if you're a tough on crime kind of person, well, you still tough on those people who are truly, at risk of being a threat or harm to other people. So so you would think you can get a good coalition of people behind, well, we should use this responsibly and it'll help us get the better outcomes that we want to have. And then we can have elections to determine kind of like the amount of punishment and different, sorts of things that as far as, but how do you use these tools to get the kind of policy decision that you, I think the cost of different document review platforms will continue to go down. Guillermo was saying that there's becoming right, and I think we'll see that for different areas. So there'll be opportunities that you could create. I think you need to change your business model, is what we see around a lot of this too. Change your thinking. So especially for small firms, I think there are opportunities in the consumer space. I'm much more of an expert on the U.S. market. But you think about folks who've thought about, like, oh, I do a particular kind of work and I have, X number of clients. Well, why isn't it 100X clients, right? Why can you figure out how to use these tools and serve many more clients? So I think there'll be opportunities to do that. Right now, a lot of these tools we're talking about are pretty expensive, so it is hard for smaller firms. But I think this goes back to the idea of being data-driven, capturing data, improving your processes, thinking about how to use data and artificial intelligence, which is then setting the stage to be able to use these tools when they become more affordable as well. And when you have your processes, you understand your processes, and you already have a data-driven organization.
You can also use development, Google's development, for example, or I don't know, probably you can buy an artificial intelligence, but for example, Google Market and all the applications that you have and are based in artificial intelligence, you can use like very little fee.
Yeah.
It's not expensive.
Yeah.
It's a first step,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, chatbots are an area where maybe too we'll see people start using chatbots. I know that there are a lot of corporate legal departments and places that are using that for just to get information out. So maybe not directly on providing the legal services, maybe on simpler things. And then once you do that, and you attract people to your website, right, and you give them a better service and they pay for other.
IBM's Open Code have a chatbot for this. IBM have a chatbot and it's open code for this.
Yeah, there are
for
a lot
example,
of places now
yes.
Chatbots. Yeah.
I think you forget a question of discussion, the possibility to decide against the artificial intelligence. In markets, the invest and with regimes which against the votes, invest against the votes, and a lot of them have a very interesting benefit in his invest. It's another possibility for
to
us.
not use artificial intelligence. So to choose not to use it, is that what you're saying?
No, I think it's a possibility.
Yeah, there are some people who have pointed out that not everyone is completely bullish. There are some people who say, oh, this is Silicon Valley hype, and there's some things here that are going to pay off, but this is just pattern recognition, and it has its limits, and so that it's not going to revolutionize things quite the way we say it's going. You know, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah,
we have to.
no.
Yes.
We have to stop.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.